Hello, and welcome to From Policy to Practice, Building the Infrastructure Future for Advanced Air Mobility. I'm Ashley Simmons, the Deputy Director for SAFE's Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. I want to thank you all for joining us for today's discussion around the policy strategies needed to develop a scalable, interoperable, and competitive advanced air mobility ecosystem. SAFE is a nonpartisan organization that is committed to transportation, energy, and supply chain policies that advance the economic and national security of the US and its allies. Since its inception 20 years ago, SAFE is focused on real-world pragmatic solutions that address both the supply and demand side considerations as part of a holistic approach to energy security. At SAFE's Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, we focus on the demand. We believe that innovation in transportation, whether on land, in the air, or by the sea, is key to building a 21st century mobility system that is safe, secure, and efficient. We believe advanced air mobility, or AAM as it's often referred to, represents one of the most exciting frontiers in this space, offering the potential to revolutionize the way people and goods move. But realizing that vision requires more than just the technology. It demands collaboration, policy innovation, the safe integration of these new forms of aircraft into the existing airspace, and infrastructure readiness. And that's why today's conversation is so important. We're bringing together experts to explore the challenges and opportunities ahead for AAM. How do we scale AAM beyond pilot programs? What infrastructure is needed to support its growth? And how can we ensure that these solutions are safe and integrated into existing transportation networks? The discussion will also briefly touch on the global competition that is taking place across this growing sector. We have an incredible lineup of speakers who will help us tackle these tough questions and more. So whether you are here as an industry insider, a policymaker, or simply someone who is just curious about the future of flight, we're glad to have you with us. With that, let's get started. I'd like to welcome my colleague, Dominic Matthew, who is also the lead author of the Coalition's latest report that came out earlier this week, titled Beyond Takeoff, Policy Strategies to Build the Infrastructure Future for Advanced Air Mobility.
Thank you, Ashley. Great to be here, and a big hello to everyone joining this webinar today.
Wonderful. So Dominic, let's just jump right in, right? So in our research, we found there are many different definitions of AAM from civil aviation organizations across the world. So I think to start off, it would be helpful if we could clarify how we define AAM and what that definition includes.
Yes, Ashley, and that's an excellent question to kick us off. To help illustrate the points that I'm going to make, I will share a couple of slides. So those should be up on your screen shortly. So the AAM industry, it's been around for a while. The term officially gets into lingo. This gets officially defined around 2015, with many civil aviation regulators defining it based on their focus areas, whether it's new aircraft designs, the type of fuel source being used, or how AAM integrates with other transportation choices. In the report, we use the interpretation provided by the International Civil Aviation Organization, or the ICAO. This is the agency that coordinates aviation globally. And their interpretation of AAM encompasses new and emerging aviation technologies that transport people or cargo between places not currently served by existing aviation modes. And as you can see on your screens, the graphic, this is a graphic from our report, and it outlines aircraft configurations and fuel types. The top line picture shows what a conventional aircraft looks like, a jumbo jet or a fighter plane. But then everything you see below it is what a potential AAM aircraft can look like. Short takeoff or landing aircraft, or STOL, for example, includes seaplanes, but also newer designs that are coming out that might run on electric or hybrid propulsion systems. A VTOL, or a vertical takeoff landing aircraft, forms the core of AAM. And helicopters have been around for a long time and are a type of VTOL. So when a VTOL becomes electric or an eVTOL, that's what you're seeing, the type of AM aircrafts that can be coming out across the industry. And finally, UAS, or unmanned aircraft systems, covers drones and autonomous VTOLs. And I would close this particular slide out by saying that what defines AAM is a combination of a bunch of things. So it could be the aircraft design, but also fuel sources, because electric propulsion systems, lithium-ion batteries, solid state or sodium-ion batteries, a hybrid propulsion system, and hydrogen fuel cells all combine together with design to form an AAM aircraft.
Thank you for that real comprehensive level setting. Let's build on that. So in the report, you also analyzed data on the global growth of the AAM market. Can you share a bit for our listeners what that growth looks like and where these applications are gaining traction?
Yes, that is a good question. So we have seen a lot of investment going into the AAM industrial sector, but large-scale investments start off around 2017, and they reached $2 to $3 billion per year. And this is very similar to what we've seen in the e-scooter, the e-bike, or the bike sharing industry, what you would collectively know as micromobility. So very similar numbers in terms of investments. But lately, what we have also seen is startups in the AAM space are raising large amounts of venture capital, particularly for many of the near-term use cases that are there on your screen. So as the graphic shows, a lot of the AAM use cases range from recreational, cargo and logistics, the near-term use cases that we are seeing today. A lot of companies testing pilots or actually sending medical supplies over short distances. And these can then, the use cases stretch over to emerging passenger applications, starting with airport shuttles, rural ex-urban connections. I would also point out that AAM plays a very critical dual use role in military and defense or enforcement operations. So not just being used for surveillance, but for tactical resupply, for search and rescue, border security and disaster response, which is turning out to be a big industry, like I mentioned, attracting a lot of investment. And then looking at Ashley's question around global markets, the graphics here show 10-year projections looking at the economic impact of AAM in different regions across the world. So the European Union, the United States, and China are expected to create a large number of jobs based on this AAM industry. The Chinese number is interesting, and I would say also remarkable, because it's part of a nationwide push to prioritize a low altitude economy. And low altitude here would mean anything below 3,000 feet. And the Chinese government, the CCP, seeks to capitalize on existing strengths in battery technology and drone manufacturing to actually strengthen places that China has traditionally lagged behind, so like aircraft manufacturing, autonomous system capabilities.
That's really interesting. Let's unpack the China bit a bit further, because some see this as really a global race for leadership across the AAM sector. How have the U.S. and China each prioritized accelerating the industry?
Yeah, that's been an interesting topic to research and also get to know a lot about. China has taken bold steps, I would say very bold steps to position themselves as AAM leaders. Through a playbook that we have seen before. There's been aggressive industrial policies, a lot of state investment, fast-tracked regulations that have allowed China in some ways to put the US at a greater risk of falling behind in the AAM industry. And as this graphic from the report shows, the Chinese Communist Party prioritized AAM way back in 2019. And according to that national strategic push, they deployed a lot of local funding to support AAM enterprises, granted autonomy to local governments to administer airspace below 3,000 feet, the low altitude airspace, created a lot of test zones for AAM flights, and pushed, I would say 70% is the data we have, 70% of Chinese provinces to integrate AAM in their long-term planning. So there's been a lot of work that's come out of that national strategy. I will also say that EHang, which is a two-seater pilotless eVTOL, is the first in the world to be certified for mass production by the Civil Aviation Administration of China. It's mostly being used for tourist purposes, but as you can see, there's a neck-to-neck race that's going on between the US and China, and our report has a US-China leaderboard that you can refer to as well. That being said, I would point out that the US still leads pretty heavily on innovation. More than 70% of all AAM-related patents are issued to American companies. And the US Federal Aviation Administration has done a good job of setting parameters to sustain and grow the industry responsibly and safely. Last year, for instance, there were a couple of firsts that the FAA did. For the first time in 80 years, the FAA created a new category of civil aircraft called bar lift aircraft. These can take off like a helicopter, but cruise on fixed wings like an aircraft. The FAA has also finalized guidelines for vertiport design. These are areas where an AAM aircraft can take off and land from. So there's a lot happening on the policy front, but as we explore more in the report, there can be a lot of other stuff that can be done as well.
Thank you for that. So it looks like policy is playing a pretty huge role in how AAM is going to scale. Could you talk a little bit about what you see as the main challenges holding the US back? Perhaps what maybe some of the policy barriers are that you think need to be addressed?
Yes, for sure. We distill three big challenges related to AAM infrastructure and operational readiness, all while recognizing the equal importance that safety plays to avoid incidents like the tragic mirror collision we saw near Reagan Airport last month. So that being said, one of the big policy blockers we looked at was, despite the FAA having oversight over airspace, national airspace, states and local municipalities decide how and where AAM infrastructure is built. And what we're seeing right now across the US is a patchwork of state and local regulations. And what this is leading to a lot of inconsistent rules, making it difficult for AAM operators to scale. And what this can then further lead to is monopolized public resources where only a few players can navigate complex approvals. And we've seen this story play out a lot of times before in the past decade with services like ride sharing, Uber and Lyft, food delivery, e-scooters and e-bikes, all competing for space on public sidewalks and roads. And what we fear happening is that without standardized policies, AAM risks facing the same regulatory gridlocks, which could slow down adoption, which could reduce competition, and we feel ultimately delays any potential benefits for consumers of AAM. The second, the second policy blocker that we look at or talk about was the challenge in legacy aviation policies. Current aviation policies were all designed around a traditional aircraft and need to be updated. Take weather tracking, for instance. Current systems focus on high altitude conditions, but don't necessarily account for low altitude microclimates like wind tunnel effect in a city with big buildings or large tall buildings, or sudden fog in rural and suburban areas, which can impact AAM operations. And finally, the one blocker being funding, which is an evergreen topic. Aviation funding is a different line item from transportation or highway funding. And much of the public funding in the US comes from the Airport and Airway Trust Fund, which is subsidized by excise taxes on flight tickets and fuel, but which is struggling to keep up with updating aviation infrastructure across the nation. So as AAM matures and cities jump into the fray to prepare themselves for operations, a combination of public and private funding will be needed to balance community needs and commercial interests.
Yeah, I agree. Those barriers all feel very real. And, we know that the FAA is working to integrate AAM aircraft into the national airspace by 2028 in a very safe, structured, and measured manner. Perhaps giving some of these considerations, could you also now walk us through what some of the key policy strategies are that are highlighted in the report for how we address these barriers?
Yes, thank you for that, Ashley. So in the report, we underline three key policy strategies that the US can take, but also detail numerous policy actions within each strategy. So I would encourage the audience to go download the report and go through each of those actions. So the first strategy aims to establish clear guidelines for long-term success and fair use of public resources to support a scalable, safe, and efficient AAM ecosystem. We compare public vertiports to shared infrastructure like public parking, space on the sidewalks, what you would know as curb space, rail terminals or airports, all of which balance competing demands and open access to multiple operators. And so we reinforce the notion that effective land use, land management is key to maximizing utility of a public resource, and that can prevent monopolization and also foster competition amongst different AAM operators. All this based on what we have seen happen in different transportation sectors before. Second, we emphasize that as the nation's aviation regulator, the FAA should take lead on setting standards for digital infrastructure, which can enable real-time communication through interoperable information frameworks and also create robust cybersecurity protocols to ensure a safe airspace. Lastly, we touch upon funding. We call for a strategy to have new and sustaining funding mechanisms, most likely stemming from Congress. The next FAA reauthorization is due in 2028. We call upon Congress to establish a national AAM infrastructure fund, which would tap into alternative funding streams, introducing new tax incentives, and fostering public-private partnerships to finance both physical and digital AAM infrastructure.
So those comprehensive policy strategies really do address a lot of the blockers that you identified at the top part of our program here today. I want to thank you for walking us through ReMo's new report, Beyond Takeoff, and highlighting, not only the key trends and where the industry is overall and the competition aspects, but also the challenges and some of the actual policy strategies that we can implement to help scale AAM. For anyone in the audience who would like to go deeper into each of the strategies and the policy actions in the report, we would encourage you to go download that report. You can access it via the QR code on screen, or also by visiting the coalition's website at reimaginedmobility.org. And so with that, I want to transition us to the second half of today's program and welcome in our panel. Our speakers will unpack the policy actions that are outlined in ReMo's report a bit further. They're also going to share their insights as experts in this space and how we can successfully scale AAM infrastructure to build both a safe and integrated ecosystem. We will also be taking audience questions a little later. And so if you have those, please submit those into the chat function. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dominic.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. So we are thrilled to have two industry experts with us today. We'll start with Nathan Trail. Nathan is the Senior Director of International, State, and Local Policy for Supernal. Supernal is the urban air mobility division of the Hyundai Motor Group. Nathan is responsible for working with state and local legislators, regulators, community stakeholders, and industry to develop state and local policies and regulations to foster the AAM industry. For those who are following AAM news, Supernal recently did some ground testing of their SA2 eVTOL at California's Mojave Air and Spaceport. So welcome, Nathan.
Thank you.
So the next person on the panel, the second person on the panel is Christopher Girdwood. Chris is the CEO of the Detroit Region Aerotropolis Development Corporation, which is a four-community, two-county public-private economic development partnership driving corporate expansion and new investment around the Detroit Metropolitan and the Willow Run airports. The Aerotropolis is playing an important role in scaling Michigan's AAM infrastructure with a variety of initiatives, including building highways in the skies to safely integrate drone technology in the airspace. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Great. So now that we have both of you here, let's start with Nathan. So Nathan, can you describe, based on all the work that you've done, why is it important for state and local governments to ensure that publicly funded vertiports maintain open access principles while balancing the needs of multiple AAM operators, and especially in high demand urban areas?
Sure. Well, I'll start, and I'm sure we'll kind of discuss this more in depth throughout the conversation by saying that one of the reasons that we're so excited about advanced air mobility is it's a localized form of aviation, right? What I mean by that is that our industry is ultimately enabled by the actions of state and local governments and the acceptances of community. And in turn, hopefully, the benefit that we all, hope advanced air mobility will bring will be felt by those local communities and by those local people. Unlike traditional aviation, where the infrastructure is at a traditional airport, our aviation infrastructure will be incorporated into communities and cities where you traditionally wouldn't zone and site aviation infrastructure. And that is to say that state and local governments have a tremendous say in making sure that this industry is successful by the jurisdictions and the authorities that they have. A big part of that is ensuring open access to publicly funded vertiports. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in some areas is a move to monopolize infrastructure, which is, even if certain vertiports and infrastructure receives public funds, to grant exclusivity to one operator or one vertiport developer. The concern that we have with that, in addition to obviously stifling innovation and competition before our industry has a chance to take off, no pun intended, is that this could potentially make this a more exclusive service, right? We intend and we hope that advanced air mobility will scale so that it's available to everyone at time, right? And you get that by making sure that it's available to everyone. It's built in areas where people use and utilize transportation services, so connecting to multimodal connectivity, but also working with communities to make sure that infrastructure is being built where there's gaps in connectivity and where there's increased congestion, as opposed to where one developer or operator decides that they can charge the most money, right? That's gearing towards more exclusivity and more of a corporate, an electrified corporate commuter, as opposed to mass public transit, which is what we hope this will be. Right? We hope everyone will be able to benefit from this technology. So, back to your question, in terms of what state and local governments can do, we've seen many efforts to ensure open access to vertiports and ensure that competition, and eventually ensure that many people have access to it. So 3 states so far, Utah, West Virginia, and Oregon, have enacted legislation which would prevent against such monopolies. And many other states this legislative session are considering the same. We think that this is a very proactive measure to not only spur the industry and spur competition, but to make sure that it's scaled in a way that best serves the communities that we aim to serve.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm going to pick on the state and local government and their role in AAM thread that you mentioned, and have Chris join the conversation. Chris, the Aerotropolis has a really interesting structure. You are an economic development organization. What role does an EDO like the Aerotropolis play along with federal, state, and other regional bodies in scaling AAM infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I really appreciate it. So here in the Detroit metropolitan area, we have this history and legacy of putting the world on wheels over the last century. And, as we look internally and engage with our state and federal partners, it's, how do we broaden the mobility sector to include advanced air mobility to help our workforce transition into industries of the future? And could the transferable skills of building the automobile be the same skills that will build advanced air mobility aircraft or vertiports or both? And so I think as we look to harnessing the talent in the workforce and making sure that we still stay present with mobility infrastructure, advanced air mobility is a sector that we've leaned heavily into in the last 5 years. And I'll give you an example. We started to think about how roads and expanding roads in Southeast Michigan was a costly endeavor. And so instead of putting a 5-pound part on a 2-ton truck and driving it to a final assembly, why not put that 5-pound part on a 40-pound drone and fly it? And so utilizing low altitude airspace to reduce the need to continue to expand roads and also look at the ecological and environmental footprint of taking a 2-ton truck off the road and using electrified advanced air mobility to do, some of the work we've been doing over the last century, which is building, high-class automobiles for not only this country, but the nation. And so we've leaned into it, and we're pretty excited about that. But I know in the next few questions, we'll deal with community integration. And so I'm really excited to talk about how we've been engaging the community in the near term.
Thank you, Chris. And you touch upon interesting point around local governance and local land use, who's building roads, who's taking care of those. Nathan, bringing you back in the conversation, why is it important for local governments to begin working on developing clear zoning and land use policies for vertiports?
Absolutely. Well, this is one of my favorite things to talk about as a state and local policy person because, right, when we think about advanced air mobility, typically people think of two things, and for good reasons. One is obviously the impressive engineering work and the technology going into developing this new form of aviation. The second is the significant work being done at the FAA level, right? Obviously, that's our federal regulator. Both are extremely important. However, we could be years down the line with both and have a hangar filled with aircrafts that are ready to go, have all the federal regulations worked out for operating in the national airspace. However, without a equally as complex and formalized set of local land use and zoning ordinances for the infrastructure that we need, we don't have an industry. So really the enablement of our industry starts at the state and local level. It really starts at the local level in terms of developing land use and zoning ordinances to incorporate vertiports into local transit networks so that this can be a workable and usable mode of mobility. And, I think I'm happy to say that, my time here at Supernal, I've worked here for about 5 years. This is still a relatively new industry. We've seen a lot of growth in interest, from cities such as Orlando is a good example, Miami, Los Angeles. We're seeing some real effort being put forward to start to develop these ordinances so that we can start to build and zone and site vertiports. But it's a great thing to continue to work on, and I think us as industry and community really needs to be making sure that we're putting forward these local ordinances that work. I've said it again, I'll probably say it a few times in this conversation, multimodal connectivity is key. Making sure that the zoning ordinances and codes can be incorporated into current transit networks so that advanced air mobility ultimately is adding to the current transportation network of a community rather than something separate.
Got it. That's a great response, Nathan. And slightly switching gears to kind of get more into the national airspace, moving away from the land use, the land policy bit. Christopher, the Aerotropolis is, and you mentioned this, is integrating AAM into the national airspace through a public-private collaboration with the AirHub platform, and you're integrating low-altitude drone operations through that. What challenges, could you expand a bit on that, but also state some of the challenges that you faced in aligning some of this technology with local community needs, and how did you overcome those?
Yeah, thanks. So we started out 5 years ago with an understanding here at the board level, which is that you don't know what you don't know. And we didn't know who was flying drones, whether it was recreational or commercial. And so we partnered early on with Airspace Link and their AirHub platform to start collecting data on where flights were happening in our communities and why those flights were happening. And that led to interesting discussions around demand-driven models for advanced air mobility that we could leverage to build on the industry. And so 4 years ago, we took a drone out to a golf course and we flew chips and soda out to hole 16, and we had Congresswoman Debbie Dingell and local officials come out. And, they talked about, is there an ordinance in place to do this? Or is there a model? Do I pay an extra $5 to have food and drinks delivered to the golf course? And so that sparked a conversation, but we doubled down on that. And 3 years ago, we went to the hospital here and we took over the helipad and we put a drone on the helipad and we flew a COVID test kit and a 1 mile loop around the hospital to understand what the demand model would look like to use drones for healthcare delivery. And then the hospital teams got involved and they started to think about, well, maybe we can do this kind of work. And the community said, you could potentially deliver my diabetes medication or an EpiPen to my niece or nephew using a drone instead of a car. And so those discussions started to take place. And 2-3 years ago, what we really decided to do was start thinking beyond visual line of sight and how we could prepare ourselves to utilize AAM for beyond visual line of sight delivery specific to our industry, which is the mobility sector. And so when we looked at the infrastructure we currently had, we started to understand rail. And there is a dense network of rail here in Southeast Michigan. And could a drone fly over a rail line? Meaning, could that rail line be sheltered infrastructure so we could create corridors to fly beyond visual line of sight from Lansing to Detroit, from Ann Arbor to Detroit, from Pontiac to Flint, and how rail could be a potential use case to identify brownfield sites, contaminated sites adjacent to rail that could be a vertiport of the future. And so redeveloping a brownfield site into a vertiport that has public use, public access, and then using rail as the future beyond visual line of sight corridors to connect all our communities through advanced air mobility. And so we're not there yet, but we're engaging local elected officials, we're engaging our Congress folks, and we're saying, hey, to the public, where's the demand use case? Where could we identify companies to see, yeah, there's profit here, and build that industry here in the Aerotropolis region. So we're having a lot of fun. We're not there yet, but we'll get there soon.
That's good to hear, Chris. I will add a follow-up question to that. It seems like you work with a tremendous amount of agencies, not just state and local, but also regional bodies. How can states how can states replicate some of the initiatives that Michigan has tried out? I've seen the AAM Activation Fund, for instance, and it seems that you have a couple of projects in the area that the Aerotropolis is in. Are there any pointers for other states looking to replicate some of the success with AAM, but also using some financing mechanism to fund or test these projects out?
Absolutely. The Michigan Department of Transportation, MDOT, and the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, have dedicated specific grant funding to this industry through the Advanced Air Mobility Activation Fund. And we've utilized that fund, and so have our partners. And so in Traverse City, for example, they're doing some very interesting things with AAM over water. And so how drones could fly beyond visual line of sight to connect communities that have traditionally been separated through waterways. Here in Southeast Michigan, we're studying the rail corridors. I know on the western side of the state, closer to Chicago, they're studying more of the defense use case for AAM. And so I think if a state was to look at its assets, it should kind of harness the capabilities of its own talent and its own infrastructure and overlay some AAM testing criteria to understand what bubbles to the surface. And that's what we've been doing in Michigan is the state has allowed locals to say, you know what you're best at, send us a proposal and let's do some pilot projects to learn. And then let's invite the public out to see those pilot projects and let's engage them to see whether or not, there's a level of comfort there to continue to fund that. And then also invite industry, because you always want to look at the demand side to make sure that the pilot's just not a pilot project, but the pilot could be a sustained use of AAM to better the mobility sector, create jobs, and drive capital investment to your region.
Got it. And you mentioned public engagement, and this is where I want to bring Nathan back in the conversation. So Nathan, can you provide examples where local governments have ensured that communities are well engaged in this whole process, and that a lot of community priorities around noise mitigation, environmental safeguards, even proximity to sensitive areas are all effectively integrated into a vertiport zoning framework?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of cities in the U.S. and municipalities that have really taken a strong look at this. One of those, which was early, was the city of Miami. They began very early on engaging with us, with other industry stakeholders, but also community to make sure that, as they look to, where should we begin to develop an infrastructure? What does that zoning ordinance look like? That community concerns were integrated. Moving across the country, the city of Los Angeles has always prioritized community integration. It's no secret there's a significant community concern right now on small airports and helicopter operations over the city. The community has concerns over noise, over carbon emissions, and as such, they're taking a more measured approach to how vertiports are developed and zoned and where that's happening. We, instead of kind of pushing back against this, we really leaned into this and working with the city to make sure that we not only highlight the benefits of advanced air mobility, obviously it's far quieter, zero carbon emissions, but to make sure that we're working with the community as well in tandem with the city, so that where AM operations take place, where the infrastructure is zoned, has a minimal to no community negative effects. So those are some examples. The city of Orlando, I should mention as well. I think they've taken a really practical approach. In addition to working with the community in the city, they've really leaned working with the airport, who is really a leader in this space, the Orlando airport, in terms of how to integrate this. Obviously the point A will be at the airport, but how is this integrated kind of thoughtfully and scalable within the rest of the surrounding county and in the city of Orlando itself? So I think those are some examples of cities that have really taken the right kind of measured approach to community integration. But they've also engaged very closely with industry to get a good perspective of what we see as the business use case, what we see in terms of how these operations will really look like. So they really leaned into collaboration as well as community integration.
Yeah, and that's a point well made, because in the report we talk about community integration, but also how do you have a much bigger perspective about the potential of AAM? And we also highlight some of the economic spillovers that we could copy from other industries, like in the Silicon Valley, for instance. Even China, with its whole national strategy around a low altitude economy, they're accounting for a huge economic spillover from AAM translating into many other industries. And so, Chris, just so looking at this from that big perspective of how does this affect the economy, how are you or the Aerotropolis ensuring that the AAM industry is held to these promises? It kind of translates these benefits across the entire region.
So we're also looking at our manufacturing base and the difference between subtractive manufacturing and additive manufacturing. And another way to say additive manufacturing is 3D printing. And so mixed metal 3D printing is now creating parts of the same form, fit, and function as subtractive manufacturing. And so as we grow the additive manufacturing base, could we also grow logistics and distribution network to distribute those 3D printed parts to where they need to be, whether it's a tier 3, tier 2, tier 1, or OEM, automotive, aerospace supplier? And so to your question, we're looking at industries that are growing, and we're trying to pair AAM with those industries. And so if you had a 100,000 square foot warehouse with 50 3D printers that are making mixed metal parts for both the aviation automotive sector, could we then deliver those parts to the final assembly operation using, AAM corridors over rail networks? And so I think to utilize the benefit of AAM, we're looking at, the business model and taking it and attaching it to industries that are growing. And so you'll see here in Detroit that we're utilizing the growth of our manufacturing base, and we're kind of latching AAM onto it to understand how that model will work. Now, from a local municipal level, we've got municipalities that are installing their own communication mesh networks to enable beyond visual line of sight corridors in partnership with Airspace Link and the AirHub platform. So, some municipalities are doing more than others, and I think your report really highlights on, how more standardization kind of would help our region and our state and the nation grow just a bit faster and more safely.
That's great, Chris. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to what's going to happen out of Michigan and the Aerotropolis in the coming months. We would be taking audience questions in a bit. And so closing this panel discussion out, last question to you, Nathan. In the report, we provide an example of a good public-private partnership in the aviation sector, the JFK Terminal 4. We highlight that as a model where private and public investment can come together under a bunch of contractual obligations to prevent operator lock-in. In your experience so far, how can similar PP or 3P models be adapted by the AAM industry?
I think it's a great kind of example that you highlight in the report. Just simply put, there's more to unpack with it, but just to make sure that, as these agreements are struck, there is built-in kind of anti-monopolistic measures. So it's great to have PPP work in projects, but to make sure that it does not grant kind of exclusivity in a broad municipality, right? That's not to say that there can't be an RFI out for one specific vertiport, and obviously if a company is chosen for that, that's fine that they can operate their course, and that they should have the first right to do that. But to make sure that we're preventing any sort of broad monopolization throughout a geography, right? Because of the nature of how advanced air mobility operations will take place, that could really stifle kind of the growth and the innovation of our industry.
Great. Perfect. I think this then brings us to the end of our panel discussion. This has been a rich discussion, so thank you so much, both Nathan and Chris. I'm going to bring Ashley back to share some questions from the audience. Ashley? Ashley, you might.
Thank you, Dominic. As a reminder, for those of you that are listening here today, if you have a question, please go ahead and submit that via the chat function. One of our first questions that's come in, I'm going to open this up for all of you, is what is a realistic time frame that we should expect AAM to be deployed and scale here in the US? And to follow that, how do you expect this rollout to be structured in terms of use cases and perhaps regions?
I'm happy to hop in
Great.
first, if that's okay. We believe that a realistic timeline in terms of when advanced air mobility will be first deployed is 2028. Kind of the stance we've always taken since we were founded. And it's important to kind of measure expectations within that, right? We all expect it and are working towards a large scaled industry, and we will achieve that. But I think in 2028, that's when you'll start to see initial operations. And what will that look like in terms of a rollout? It will likely be an isolated point A to point B. So the logical starting point will be at an existing airport or aviation infrastructure, and then probably the point B would be near a dense urban environment, probably not located within. And from there, operations will take place kind of back and forth for commercial passenger operations, and then it'll be scaled out from there. But really, that can only be done if we make sure that we do a lot of the things that we've all been discussing so far, making sure that we're working closely with community and transit authorities, so that as we're ready to kind of scale out operations, the infrastructure is ready and available, and associated regulations at all levels of government are already ironed out, and not having to do that retroactively. In terms of use cases, obviously, it's important we're very much focused on the air taxi service, but there's also really exciting, maybe even initial use cases around search and rescue and for first responders that this technology would really benefit. So I think the utilization and use cases are going to vary, but it's just important to note, and I think it's welcome among community and government as well. Operations will be isolated to start. They will be well planned out, and that they will scale organically from there as the community accepts it and as the need appears.
Thanks for that. Chris, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. So from our perspective, we're hyper-focused on the demand side model for drone delivery in low altitude airspace. And so whether that demand side model says we're going to take a tier 2 automotive supplier who's 3D printing the same part in form, fit, and function that it has been using subtractive manufacturing, deliver it to a final assembly. What's the cost benefit of using a drone as opposed to a vehicle on the road? And are there other externalities we need to be taken into consideration from an environmental and ecological standpoint? And I think, once we understand the use case and the profitability of using AAM, I think, you're going to see it flourish. But right now, what we're trying to understand is where that demand is. And so going back to, the golf course, it wasn't profitable to fly soda and chips out to hole 16 using a drone. It was fun, but it wasn't profitable. When you go to the hospital model, we were so close to understanding the profitability of using a drone to deliver an EpiPen or diabetic medication. And so, I think in the next 2-3 years, the mathematics are going to start to play out, and you'll see the beyond visual line of sight drone corridor flourish. But we're still in that study phase, but we're getting close.
And
Great.
Ashley,
ahead.
if I could add something as well, this kind of the question also goes back to first slide around what is actually AAM. If you're thinking about drones and autonomous drones as part of AAM, which a lot of definitions would include, you already see a lot of operations happening and being deployed in the US. You have companies like Walmart and Amazon deploying drones to send parcels and cargo over. I volunteer at our local emergency coalition group where we use drones to do a lot of fire and rescue operations during fire or look up critical infrastructure. So there are a lot of use cases that are currently being rolled out across the US. If you're looking at passenger applications, that would be sometime in the horizon.
Another listener has asked if we can expand a bit on some of the strategies that can help ensure community engagement and support for AAM projects. Who might want to take that?
Yeah, I can get started with what we looked at was local elected officials, planning commissions early on. And so, how do you write an ordinance that's never been written before? And, we have a few municipalities here in the Detroit region that were active in trying to understand. And so I would start with your planning commission, local city council, local elected officials, and engage them first because they're the representative body of the public in the municipality. And then hold events. And, we had a lot of fun inviting the public out to local golf courses, the local hospital, and extend those invitations. And so not only do you have your local elected officials and your planning commission members there, but you have members of the public there, and then engage them in the process when a pilot is unfolding and you're seeing a drone in operation under specific safety criteria. Moving beyond that, once the ordinance is developed, it could be amended and rewritten. And so it's an iterative process. I wouldn't say that once the ordinance is written, it'll be set in stone, but I think getting to a local ordinance is a good first step.
Completely agree with that. Just want to build on a point that was made, which is, yes, I think a lot of, municipalities are in this phase now where they're kind of ready to enact a zoning ordinance, but they're saying, well, I know that the technology is still developing. There's a lot of federal regulations developing, and that's absolutely correct. And you obviously don't want to get out ahead of those. But the point that Chris just made, it's a starting point, right? These ordinances will obviously develop as the use cases and the technology and the infrastructure does as well. But it's important to have that first step. We really do think now is the time to do that and to make sure that there's a priority on collaboration so that as those modifications and amendments need to be made and built upon, rather, we're ready to do that. In terms of community integration, completely agree. And, I kind of highlighted earlier, the need to engage with local government, but community as well, right? All of these things will, in terms of the advanced air mobility industry, will only be successful if people are comfortable and excited about utilizing this, right? If people are going to buy a ticket to ride on an advanced air mobility aircraft, on an eVTOL. And in order to do that, the community has to be comfortable and accept this as a safe form of mobility that would be useful to them, right? Otherwise, why would they do that? And to do that, we need to make sure that the community, the people in the community that we aim to serve, are familiar with not only the technology itself, so community events, I completely agree, is a great idea, but that we as industry stakeholders are being transparent in terms of how this will look, how this will be incorporated into the community, where the operations will take place, and the benefit that we ultimately hope to bring. So I think that this industry, with many new forms of industry, especially transportation, it's important, but I think it's especially important with us to make sure that we're very much focused on prioritizing that community education and integration aspect.
Thank you both for that. In the past several decades, we have seen, a boom in new transportation services, form factors, sometimes with challenges with integration, getting them into the modal mix. You guys touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the discussion here today. One of our listeners has asked, what steps are necessary to consider how to ensure that AAM integration is as seamless and additive as possible? Who might want to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in
Great.
quick because I kind of got out ahead of myself and I talked on that already in my previous answer. But obviously focusing on community integration to make sure that, I'll frame it slightly differently. There's other forms of new mobility, the e-scooters and so forth that were kind of just kind of thrust upon and dropped into local communities without really, the pre-engagement to, talk about, how they can be done so thoughtfully. I think it's important that we do that. In addition to that, making sure that, in terms of integration, we do so with multimodal connectivity. So where we zone and develop our infrastructure, I think it should be in places where people are already kind of utilizing. So, park and rides, bus lines, metro transit systems. We want this to be incorporated into how people are currently utilizing transportation services as opposed to being something separate.
All right. Let's talk about competition again. Can any of you speak to what the US can really do to maintain a competitive edge here? Dominic spoke, I think in the report, it talks about the US is leading in innovation, but how do we ensure that that remains?
Yeah, just briefly, I know that, here in the Midwest, in particular, Detroit, mobility runs through our blood. And so we look at transportation industries and knowing full well that, the advanced air mobility industry could complement or supplement the automotive sector, but understanding how it could, be in addition to, and not looking at as potentially selling less vehicles because of AAM, but understanding how the automotive industry can play a significant role in innovating along with all of the new aerospace vehicles that will be operating in low altitude airspace. And so, we're pretty happy that our region has kind of rebranded itself as not only the automotive city, but also the city of mobility and mobility in general. And so I think one of the ways we can stay competitive hyper locally, but also nationally, is looking beyond the current industry that might be supplying many jobs for our community members and saying, what's next? And embracing it and not looking at it as detrimental to the existing jobs we have in an existing industry, but embracing the industry as it evolves. And so we've done a good job here in Detroit saying we're the mobility hub, not just the automotive hub. And that's really helped us and our workforce embrace AAM and the new industries of the future.
I would also add in, Ashley, that putting my safe and ReMo hat on, if we take an ecosystem view of the entire AM industry and see where does some of the direct and indirect impacts fall, that would be a great way to kick off being or staying competitive with other nations. Just not looking at AM as a separate siloed industry by its own, but speaking to the multimodality piece, where does it intersect with other forms of transportation, other use cases, and where can it be integrated into an ecosystem approach versus just treating it as a separate industry on its own?
Appreciate that. Did you
And
want to
I'll just add quickly, the way to be competitive is to make this service in the US be as widely utilized as possible. And the way to do that is to make it available and affordable. Going back to what we talked about earlier, we think making sure that we protect open access to infrastructure is a critical component of that. Highlighted very well throughout the report. We have the engineering talent, we have the industry here in the US. We need to make sure that the industry and the market itself is openly accessible to everyone. And we think that that's a critical component of how to stay competitive here in the US.
Thank you all. So one last question from the audience. I think this is a great way to end, actually. Someone would like to better understand what is the best way for states and cities who are interested in considering AAM operations in their area to think about engaging with operators?
Yeah, so we have specific areas here in the state of Michigan that are designated testing zones for mobility. For example, the American Center for Mobility, ACM, is a 500-acre autonomous vehicle testing facility. And so you can bring your new autonomous technology and test it there in this environment. And so to other states and other regions, I would look at in your backyard, is there a place where you could potentially test new technology, whether It's a facility that's no longer in operation, but it has a large surface area. Could you invite one of the operators out and say, we'd just like to put on a public demonstration. Can you just show us your technology? I think one of the ways that we saw ourselves early on in the Detroit region in the state of Michigan was having testing facilities available for new technologies. And those testing facilities allowed us to recruit new technologies and new innovations and understand where they were going. And then while they were here testing, it allowed us to put on our economic development hat and say, we've also have some facilities here for you to manufacture as well. And so it's just a great way for municipalities and states to get involved with engaging new technology through identifying testing facilities in your own backyard where you can see these technologies kind of highlight their own capabilities to, not only the economic development teams and, state government and city government, but, the broader audience like we talked about.
And then just to quickly add to that, I think another important measure, and we've seen this now over the past few years in many states, is to create these mechanisms for ongoing collaboration between operators, industry, and government. And we've seen this, by way of a lot of state task forces. There's probably over a dozen states, maybe even more, that have these advanced air mobility task forces to kind of assess the regulatory hurdles and actions that are needed to enable this industry. That's important, and it's important to not just have a 2-day workshop for that to be an ongoing forum for collaboration. Because as we talked about earlier, the use cases, where operators think they'll be able to operate, that's going to expand. The technology will expand. So it's important that as OEMs and operators continue to develop from a technological standpoint, from a use case standpoint, we're working closely with government so that they can evolve as well in terms of the regulations that they're putting in place to help support and enable the industry.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion of today's program. I want to thank you all for joining us for this discussion that highlighted the critical role that policy, infrastructure, and community engagement plays in order to scale advanced air mobility from vision to reality. At SAFE's Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, we remain committed to driving forward solutions that are safe, secure, and efficient in a multimodal mobility system. We encourage you to stay engaged with us and explore ReMo's full report Beyond Takeoff for deeper insights. So on behalf of SAFE and our panelists today, Nathan, Dominic, Chris, thank you. And we look forward to working with everyone here to make this vision a reality. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.